One of the key contributions that's being made by Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail has to do with the conception of law and its relationship to morality. And what we're going to see here is he's going to talk about just and unjust law. And he's going to put it in a context that has some very traditional roots, long-standing roots in the Western philosophical and also religious tradition. We'll talk about that in a moment. But he's also going to make some novel contributions and talk in some very helpful ways about how this would actually apply in the situation of American segregation and racism during the civil rights struggle, but also in ways that would have a lot of application today. So what we're looking at is nonviolent resistance to unjust laws, because that's exactly what landed King and a number of other people in jail in Birmingham. So he's being accused not only by the city of Birmingham, but also by his fellow pastors of playing fast and loose with the notion of legality. And he addresses an issue. He says, "You express a great deal of anxiety over our willingness to break laws." So what he wants to do is provide some sort of very clear criterion for saying which laws we ought to obey and which laws we ought not to obey or actually ought to break. He says, since we so diligently urge people to obey the Supreme Court's decision outlawing segregation in the public schools, it may at first glance seem rather paradoxical for us consciously to break laws. So somebody might ask, how can you advocate breaking some laws and obeying others? What they're looking for there is some sort of consistency, some sort of criterion for what would allow a person to actually break the laws. King then says, there's two kinds of law. There's just laws. Those you actually should follow. We have no problem with those. And then there's unjust laws. And he even brings up St. Augustine to say an unjust law, in a certain sense, isn't really a law. What King is doing is placing himself within a historical tradition of looking at laws, one that comes to us in large part through Christian thinkers like Augustine. He brings up Thomas Aquinas. A little bit later he's going to talk about a contemporary Jewish thinker and a contemporary Christian thinker, Martin Buber and Paul Tillich. And he's going to try to answer the question, well, what then actually makes laws just? So one way of talking about it, and King does this first, is he says, a just law squares with the moral law or the law of God. So what does it mean to square with? He doesn't give you an awful lot there because he's going to move on to that very quickly. But he says an unjust law is a code that's out of harmony with the moral law. And here what we see is that it may make some people very nervous that he's talking about the law of God. But again, within this long-standing Christian tradition of understanding what the meaning of law is, the law of God and the moral law, at least to some degree, overlap. As a matter of fact, one of the important transitions that Thomas Aquinas will talk about in moving from the Jewish conception of law to a later Christian conception of law embodied in the New Testament is going to be that the ceremonial stuff is going to get left aside as not really being important, but that the moral law is going to get actually reinforced. So, for example, the law against killing. If you look at the Sermon on the Mount, which is, pretty typical articulation of Christian ideas and values, what Jesus tells the gathered crowds is, the law says don't kill. But I tell you that if you get angry with your brother, your fellow human being, you're, in a sense, killing him. And so, don't get angry. Don't say racha to him. Racha is sort of like, expressing anger. And don't call him a fool, because if you do, you're subject to judgment. Instead, you're supposed to reconcile with those. And that's a sort of further expression of what it means not to kill. Likewise, the injunction against adultery, On the Sermon on the Mount, it's, don't look at somebody else in lust because you're committing adultery in your heart. So the moral law and the law of God, to square with them means to actually align or harmonize with them. Laws that don't harmonize with the moral law, which is being set up as a higher criterion for man-made laws or human laws, civil laws as we call them, laws that don't harmonize with that aren't really laws. They're not really binding. They don't have the force behind them. It may be difficult sometimes to distinguish exactly what is in line with the moral law and what's not, depending on how messed up one's moral compass is, or the society that you're in. Another way that he talks about it, and here he brings up Thomas Aquinas very explicitly, is that the just law is rooted in the eternal law and natural law. Now, this is really, it may sound different to you, but he's really saying the same thing by this as he was by this. The eternal law, according to Thomas Aquinas, is the law of God. It's God as law, sort of putting something out there into the entire universe. So the eternal law is, you might say, and this is oversimplifying, is God's way of wanting things to be for the entire cosmos down to the particulars. And human laws can participate in the eternal law because we're that kind of creature. We have rationality. We're able to, have some part in providence. This is what Thomas Aquinas saying that. The real expression for human beings takes place in terms of natural law. Natural law for Thomas Aquinas is not yet at the level of, the laws of the land, the laws that lawgivers are making. It's more a set of moral codes that we are able to grasp by the use of our human faculty of reason applied to, as Thomas says, our inclinations. So if we look at our inclination to continue in our own being, and sort of generalize that, we realize that life is something valuable and we should not take life unless, say, to prevent some greater evil. That taking life in and of itself is a bad thing. So, thou shalt not kill can be understood as a commandment coming from, a religious text, but it can also be understood, even with, if you don't have those religious texts, you can sort of look at the fabric of the universe and our inclinations and say, yeah, we shouldn't kill people. You can also derive not stealing from that, not violating, some sort of sexual norm in terms of adultery, not bearing false witness, that is not lying, not corrupting the communicative situation that we're in, right? So the natural law is something that Thomas Aquinas thinks that all rational, reasonable, sufficiently developed human beings ought to be able to grasp in its generality, not coming down yet to the level of particulars. It's when it gets to particulars that it gets kind of messy. So that provides us with another criterion. An unjust law is a human law that's not rooted in eternal law and natural law. So to not be rooted in those means that it doesn't have any sort of basis. It's not actually doing what reason tells us we ought to do. It might express some sort of feeling like we ought to do this sort of thing, but it could be out of harmony with these. So far, King has just sort of echoed the tradition at this point. Here, he introduces something new of his own, a new formulation, a new way of thinking out what all of this stuff here would mean for the 20th and for the centuries beyond the 20th century. A just law, he says, uplifts human personality. An unjust law, by contrast, what does it do? It degrades human personality. So we have a new idea here of human personality, human personhood, what it means to be a human being, what it means to be a person. So there's a couple corollaries that we can draw from this that help us think out what this means a bit more concretely. It treats persons as persons, not things. Here he brings up Martin Buber. Martin Buber was this Jewish philosopher and theologian of the 20th century who had this wonderful book called I and Thou. And in I and Thou, the central idea is there are, a relationship between persons is an I-thou, or if you want to put it in more modern English, I-you relationship, or you-I. No, the I is over there, the you is me, right? When we treat people as less than people, we treat them as an I-it relationship. So, here's a great example of this. Imagine that when I'm talking to this camera, the camera isn't it, it's an object, it's just a thing. But it's a thing through which I actually speak to another person. On the other hand, I can treat you as a student as not really being a person, but just being something there, say, to generate revenue for me, or to get me good ratings on ratemyprofessor.com, or to get off of my back so I can get to my important research. These are the sorts of traps that professors sometimes fall into in the course of their teaching. We can think of all sorts of other examples in other venues as well. If I don't treat you as a person, I am imposing an I-it relationship. There's a dynamic where, there's an imbalance is introduced. A difference is institutionalized, you might say, or imposed. And I treat myself as having greater value than you. I treat you as having value only insofar as you satisfy the demands, the desires, the needs that I have, or, insofar as you fit into some other scheme. But I don't treat you as another me, as something else having value, able to set ends for itself, able to chart out its own way of life. If I was, here'd be another great example, again, having to do with pedagogy. People ask me all the time, where should I start? I want to start studying philosophy, what should I do? What textbook should I get? And so I always say, well, start with Plato. Why Plato? Well, because he's really at the beginning, not the, complete beginning, but close enough. And, it gives you a good set of vantage points to start from. And then you can start moving out, in other places. And, sometimes they take my advice and sometimes they don't, Now, if I were to say, you can only start with Plato, and if you do anything other than that, you're an idiot. Don't even talk to me after that. I would be, in effect, imposing an I-it relationship upon you. I would be degrading your personality by that action, not treating you in a way that shows any sort of mutual respect. And there can be mutual respect even in imbalanced relationships. If you're coming to me as a student and you're seeking my advice as a professor, there is an imbalance there. But I can still treat you as a person while recognizing that you don't have, 20 years of studying philosophy in, like I do, so that I can come to better judgments about where you ought to start. I can still treat you as somebody who is worthy of respect, as somebody who can set their own goals, who, when they're being given advice, is not actually looking for a iron cage of rationality, to use Max Weber's phrase, to be imposed upon them, but rather to be given something that would be useful for them, which then they can decide to do. So, when we treat persons as persons, we are uplifting human personality. And this may not only be a matter of sort of negative, keeping our hands off, allowing the other person to do what they're doing, but something positive when we're doing things like outreach that take somebody who's vulnerable and improve their situation in some way. Or sometimes even when we confront somebody, but we do it in a loving way and we say, look, you're screwing up, buddy. You got to fix this. And here's some resources to do that with. And I'd love to see you, moving along this way, because it hurts me to see you in such confusion and pain. When we do that, we're uplifting human personality. When we treat people in ways that degrade them, that humiliate them, that subjugate them, that exploit them, we reduce them to objects. We are degrading human personality even as we're making use of human personality. When we treat people as responsible so that we can punish them or penalize them, but we don't treat them as responsible in allowing them to have any of the privileges that ought to counterbalance that, we are degrading human personality, Martin Luther King would say. Another way that we could think about this is that we're not damaging human personality. So, when it comes to segregation, he says this is, very clearly against the natural law, the eternal law, the moral law, however you want to consider it. Why? Because segregation degrades the human personality. What does it do? It does it in two different ways. He says it gives some people an inflated and, ungrounded sense of superiority, and it gives other people a wrong sense of inferiority. Now, what would be wrong? What would be bad about giving somebody an inflated, unfounded sense of superiority? How are you damaging their personality? Isn't that good? You're increasing their self-esteem. Well, you're keeping them from being able to actually grow. By giving them a wrong-headed conception of how good they are, you're depriving them of the opportunity to ever say, man, I need to, make something better of myself. So, when it came to whites and blacks in the South, the way that things were working under segregation, no matter how bad of a person a white person was, they could always say, well, at least I'm not a black person. And, what did that preclude? If you've got some sort of problem that you should be working on yourself so that you can make yourself into a better person. Let's say you beat your children, and bully them and abuse them. You can say, well, at least I'm not like those black people over there. No, you're a terrible bully and a terrible person, and you're probably worse than them, but you don't realize it because you've been given this sense of superiority by the way the laws work, by the way the society is structured, by who gets opportunities and who doesn't. On the other side, you have the sense of inferiority, and it leads to what King at one point calls a pervasive sense of nobodiness. There were so many abuses that were going on so many times, repeated over and over again. It was such a pervasive aspect of segregated culture that people would come to the conclusion that they really didn't matter as persons. In a sense, they're non-persons. Ralph Ellison has a novel that's written really around the same era called The Invisible Man, and it deals with this sense, and he's in the North, of racial inferiority as something that was, pushed by the culture. That, when you're considered to be nobody, you are actually invisible to everybody else, unless you constitute a problem, and then, just crush the problem, make them conform. And so King is saying that this is clearly unjust. The laws that pertain to segregation are damaging to the human personality, not only of the oppressed, and that's bad enough, but also to the oppressor, who seems to be getting a good deal out of it. A little bit later on, he'll say something else that's particularly important as well. Oftentimes people want to frame things in terms of law and order, and King reminds us that law and order exist for the purpose of establishing justice. They do not embody or exhaust justice on their own. So there's some sort of higher standard that has to govern laws, that has to govern order, that has to govern the execution, the enforcement of laws with policies, with individual actions. And for King, it's going to be this interesting criteria of whether it promotes or whether it degrades human personality. Now, there are a set of obligations that we can talk about in relation to this. King, again, wants to reassure the fellow clergy people and the greater audience of this work that they are not lawbreakers, that they are actually doing the right thing in having these demonstrations. So he says there's actually an obligation or responsibility to obey just laws. There's an obligation on everybody's part to do what's in accordance with the moral law, to do what's in accordance with the natural law, to do the things that would actually promote human personality or recognize human personality, to not do the things that would go against that. This provides something that applies not just to King and his followers, but everybody in society. On the other hand, there is an obligation or responsibility, he says, to disobey unjust laws. It's not enough just to say, well, we'll follow the laws that are good laws, and the laws that are bad laws, we'll just not, pay attention to that stuff over there. We'll kind of like pretend like we're not listening. King says, no, if you're really a moral person and there are unjust laws in place, you have a responsibility to break those laws, to undermine those laws, to call attention to them. It's not enough just to stand by and to say, well, I'm just not going to follow them. And it doesn't have to lead to violence. We're going to talk about that in a moment. But there is some responsibility to stand up against them. He gives you some great examples of this. He says, there's nothing new about this kind of civil disobedience. It was evidenced in the refusal of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to obey the laws of Nebuchadnezzar in the Babylonian captivity. Is a biblical story. On the ground that a higher moral law was at stake, it was practiced by the early Christians who are willing to face torture rather than to submit to certain unjust laws of the Roman Empire. To a certain degree, he says, academic freedom is a reality today because Socrates practiced civil disobedience. In our own nation, the Boston Tea Party was another act of civil disobedience. So the Boston Tea Party, interesting case, he's saying the Boston Tea Party, which is an anti-tax revolt, was people following through on their responsibility to disobey unjust laws. So we all have a responsibility not only to follow just laws, but to stand up and to resist injustice when we find it. How are we supposed to do that? So here's where civil disobedience comes in. So that law breaking, it has to be done, and there's three conditions for this. It has to be done openly. Openly means that you're not concealing the fact that you're breaking the law. So, for example, if you think that the tax codes are unfair, you don't simply, sweep everything under the rug. You actually say, look, I'm not going to pay these taxes, and you can do what you're going to do, but I'm not paying this tax that goes for this unjust purpose of oppressing people or destroying communities. I just won't do it. When it comes to other issues, certain actions are automatically going to be done fairly openly, but there's a lot of possibility for concealment. So King is saying, no, you have to be upfront about it. Lovingly. Well, it has to be done not only out of a sense of, justice, but out of a attempt, not necessarily to feel lovey-dovey towards the oppressor, but to treat them in a loving fashion. It doesn't do any good to, if you're going to say that just laws should uplift human personality, unjust laws should not damage it or degrade it. It doesn't do any good for a person who is breaking an unjust law to degrade somebody else's personality. So, for example, the common practice, Martin Luther King would not go along with people calling cops pigs when they were doing resistance. They would have to treat the police, even though the police may be engaging in brutality towards them, they'd have to treat the police in a loving way. Otherwise, the whole thing breaks down. Accepting whatever penalties are imposed is another criterion. A willingness to accept the penalty, he says. I submit that an individual who breaks a law that conscience tells him is unjust and who willingly accepts the penalty of imprisonment in order to arouse the conscience of the community over its injustice is in reality expressing the highest respect for law. So this is how one expresses the highest respect for law and for morality in general. You could think of this as what King is saying is the civil rights demonstrators are actually obeying a higher law. They're going against unjust laws that other people think are, for the moment, are just laws, precisely in order to show them that they are unjust laws and to issue a call to them to quit following unjust laws and to align themselves with just laws, and thereby to participate in a larger community, which would be improving their own personalities. He also gives us three interesting, what he calls examples of unjust laws. And these are worth taking a look at. He says, An unjust law is a code that a numerical or power majority group compels a minority group to obey, but does not make binding on itself. So you have a case of the majority versus the minority imposing some sort of condition on them and not actually following that condition itself. Treating them as what we call second-class citizens, or third or fourth, or even non-citizens. That is an example of unjust laws. Why? Well, let's think about this criteria of degrading personality. How does it feel to have somebody else telling you to do something that they themselves don't do? It doesn't have to be, by the way, in terms of law. It could be in terms of family dynamics. Think about your experience when your parents told you to do things or not to do things that they didn't follow themselves. Great example, smoking. My mother and father, when I was a kid, smoked at the dinner table until they finally quit smoking. And neither one of them actually did quit smoking. They'd go off and sneak puffs here and there the rest of their life. My dad's life was very short, unfortunately. My mom's life was fairly short. So, who knows what they would have done in old age. But they told us kids, you should never smoke. It's a terrible thing to do. And, they were actually right. But, of course, both of us, my sister and I started smoking when we were in our teens. And, we enjoyed it quite a bit. I think both of us are quit now. But there was that sense of, well, who are you to tell me not to do something when you're doing it yourself? What's the feeling that goes along with that? It's a feeling of powerlessness. It's a feeling of being treated as less than a person. So, when a majority does that to a minority, imposes conditions on them that they themselves don't follow, particularly with a legal regime, it's going to make people sense that they're being degraded, that their personality is not being respected. He says, this is difference made legal. A just law is a code that a majority compels a minority to follow, but that majority follows it itself. This is sameness made legal. So if we want to say that nobody gets to have public demonstrations, then nobody gets to have public demonstrations. That's a bad law anyway. But if we want to say everybody has to pay a certain tax, a certain amount of their income, then everybody has to do it. Not just, the poor and the middle class have to pay the taxes, and the rich are able to find all sorts of havens or exemptions or get amnesty. Those would be examples of unjust laws. He gives you another example. He says, a law is unjust if it is inflicted on a minority that, as a result of being denied the right to vote, had no part in enacting or devising the law. This was indeed the case in the South. The Jim Crow regime had systematically excluded African Americans from voting, often in areas where they were the majority, if they were allowed to vote. Not having a right to express oneself within the political community, and at the same time having the power of law imposed upon one, again, turns a person into effectively a legal non-person, a mere subject but not a citizen. And King is calling attention to the degrading function that this has. Third example has to do with application. This is where it gets really, really sticky and also really important. You can have laws that on their face appear to be just, You can require, for example, in the case that they're talking about there, that if you're going to have a demonstration or a parade or a march, you have to get a permit. It's the application of laws that by themselves could be proper, perfectly fine, just, whatever you want to say, prudent. When the application is unjust, when it is used to go against people and their development, when it's used to treat people unfairly, then the law itself can become unjust, at least in its application. That is exactly what was going on in Birmingham, he says. He says, an ordinance like that becomes unjust when it is used to maintain segregation and deny citizens the First Amendment privilege of peaceful assembly and protest. So what are we really talking about here in terms of application? We could think about it in three ways. One would be the intent. If you're passing a law just to try to screw a bunch of people over, to keep them from actually practicing something that should be their free rights, when you're using it just to get in their way, that's an unjust law in application. When a law's function is to do that sort of thing, and there's no conscious intent, but there's kind of a subconscious, let's keep those people down mentality promoting it, then it's still unjust. Even if the effect of it turns out to be unjust, turns out to be unfair, turns out to be degrading to people, once you become aware of that, even if the original intent was not to try to hurt anybody or to, put anybody in a one-down position, once you become aware that the effect of laws and policies is in fact to degrade human personality, then you become responsible for engaging that as an unjust law. A great example of this would be, think about our current prison systems. I don't want to say system because we actually have a whole bunch of systems. Those are, examples of application of the criminal justice code. And a lot of pretty horrific things go on, a lot of very exploitative things go on. Once you become aware of those things going on, Martin Luther King says you've got a certain responsibility. So all of this is geared towards figuring out how to address this issue of unjust laws. An unjust law, like I said at the beginning, turns out not really to be a law at all. It doesn't just lack binding force like a just law. One actually has a responsibility, Martin Luther King says, to go against it.